Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to talk about John Garang, and in particular, how he would have ended to be the most learned president in East Africa and one of the most learned in Africa. Today, when you talk about South Sudan, especially regarding access to education, most people will say that South Sudan maybe ranks the lowest in East Africa. It's still a very young country that is still working out issues. And for a very long time, that part was ignored by the government in Khartoum, and very little effort was put in place to build schools and colleges. So when we talk about education in East Africa, many people, of course, will conclude that South Sudan has a long way to go, especially when you compare it to its neighbors. But here is a very interesting fact. If John Garang, the leader of SPLA and SPLM, had lived long enough to be the president of South Sudan, he would have been the most learned president in East Africa. And you just have to look at his profile to realize that, and also bearing in mind or having in mind the education levels of the presidents that have been in East Africa and those ones that are still around. Now, John Garang was born in 1945, and he was born in South Sudan, of course. During this time, South Sudan was, of course, part of Sudan. And in 1945, Sudan itself wasn't yet independent. It was still a colony of both Britain and Egypt. It's interesting. Sudan is one of the few countries in Africa that were colonized by basically two countries together. Now, Sudan becomes independent in the 1950s. But then there are issues about South Sudan, and the issues start almost immediately because during the negotiations to give Sudan independence, the people of the South were basically ignored. They were not represented. So the British and the Egyptians just talked to the people of the North, mostly Arabs, and they had negotiations with them, and then they decided to give Sudan independence. Now, ignoring the people of the South, who in fact formed a very huge part of the population of Sudan, was a big blunder because those people felt, of course, ignored, left out of whatever negotiations went on. But more importantly, the people who were given the powers, the people of the North, mostly Arabs, they decided to implement policies that kind of like just ignored what other people within the nation stood for. For example, they decided to pursue a Sharia law kind of governance, and that didn't go well with the people of the South. Now, that's the environment in which John Garang was born. He started his elementary education at a place called Wau, and then he went to Rumbek. Now, it is when he was at Rumbek that he decided to join the Anyanya rebellion, and he goes with many other young people. But the leaders of the rebellion looked at these young men and they were like, it's not good or it's not right for these young people to come and join our ranks. They are better off going and getting an education because we'll need educated people later on, maybe after we've been successful at getting whatever we are fighting for. So Garang was persuaded alongside other young people of South Sudan to go and get an education, and that's when he went to Tanzania. He goes to Tanzania to get his secondary education, and he completes his secondary education in Tanzania, and then he gets a scholarship, and this scholarship takes him to Grinnell College in Iowa, United States, and he goes there in 1969, and he earns a Bachelor of Arts in economics. Now, after graduating from Grinnell College, he gets another scholarship, and he gets a scholarship to go and study at the University of California, Berkeley, but he turns that offer down. He prefers going back to Tanzania, and he goes to the University of Dar es Salaam, where he studies East African agricultural economics as Thomas J. Watson Fellow. That was part of the University of Dar es Salaam. Now, he graduates from there, and then he goes back to South Sudan and he joins the rebels that were still fighting. That is close to the 1970s. And when he goes back to South Sudan, he and several other young men are picked by the leaders of the rebellion and they are sent to Israel to study. They go to a military school in Israel. And he goes there for maybe 1 or 2 years, and then he comes back to South Sudan. Now, when he comes back, it's 1972 almost, and there is a peace agreement that is signed in Ethiopia between the rebel leaders and, of course, the government of Sudan. And that was thought was going to end all the problems that existed between the people of South Sudan and the government at Khartoum. And part of the agreement was all the people that were fighting in South Sudan as rebels were going to be absorbed into the national army. And that happened. And John Garang, of course, joined the army of Sudan. While he's a soldier in the national army of Sudan, he gets another opportunity to go and study, and he goes back to the United States, where he takes an infantry officer's advanced course at Fort Benning, Georgia, United States. That seems like some military academy. And then he stays there, and he extends his stay in the United States, because then, after going through that training, he goes to do his master's at the Iowa State University. He does his master's there, and then he extends his stay again. And it's 1981, he earns his PhD in economics from the same university, the Iowa State University. So he becomes a doctor. And yeah, so that is the summary of his academic background. And when you look at that summary, especially considering the time, his age mates, who were president maybe in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, most of the presidents in East Africa a few of them didn't even have a college degree. And so he stood out. If he had had the opportunity of becoming the president of South Sudan, he would definitely have stood out. He would have been a giant academically, especially amongst his peers, the presidents in East Africa. And of course, he would have been also standing tall among the presidents from Africa, I would say. But unfortunately, he didn't get that opportunity. In January 2005, of course, South Sudan and Sudan signed what came to be known as the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. And part of that agreement meant that South Sudan was to hold a referendum later on to determine whether it wanted to become an independent country. And in the meantime, John Garang was going to be a vice president to al-Bashir, who was the president of Sudan, and then a referendum was to be held. But unfortunately, a few months later, just after being appointed to be the vice president of Sudan, John Garang died on the 30th of July in a helicopter crash. And now he never got the chance to be the president, of course. And that, of course, was very unfortunate. But now, considering that if death had not stood in his way, he would definitely have become the president of South Sudan. And it would have been very interesting that he would have been one of the most learned president in East Africa, in a country that everybody agrees that it likely has the least infrastructure when it comes to education. Those are my random thoughts.